everybody, good morning, Jean here. I'm on my front porch. It's such a beautiful day. I thought I'm going to show you my latest quilt, which actually, if you've been following along in my videos, you'll have seen me construct it. It's my ever so wonderful 10-minute quilt block. You know I've done it to death. But I really like it, and if you remember on some of the videos back, we have constructed it together. If you remember, this is the one that has just the two large blocks that we put together. Go back on my videos and see how it's constructed, but I just wanted to show you my finished quilt. If you remember, I was constructing the backing of it with the seam down it. That was my one video, to construct the back of a quilt with my seam and how I was going to quilt it. So I actually finished quilting it. And I was thinking that a lot of people, a lot of people perhaps are making this quilt block because it works up so very quickly. But you've finished the quilt top, and then you're like, well, I'm a beginner quilter. How in the world am I going to quilt this quilt, having sandwiched it, having put it together? So that's what this video is going to be. I'm going to show you, not step by step, but some steps along the way, how I actually quilted this quilt. And I did it all on my home sewing machine. That's the whole point. Perhaps you quilters are taking things to a long arm quilter, which is wonderful. The long arm quilters that load their quilts on these huge, great machines can quilt a quilt top in about 4 hours, if that. And it's marvelous. You're going to pay for that service. So a lot of people are like, well, I can't afford a long arm quilter, but how am I going to quilt a large quilt? Well, as a beginner, you're not going to be doing king size quilts. You might not even be doing queen or full size. This is a small twin size quilt, a large throw quilt. And the one thing you're going to say is, how in the world do I get into the middle? This is the very middle of this quilt. Well, you'll see on my video how I maneuver it. Yeah, it does take some shoulder work. I usually, this one I didn't, I started on the edges, but I usually start the hardest place, which is in the middle. And even on a small machine, like I said, with some scrunching, the most important thing though, that I can't reiterate enough, is when you're going to try to quilt on your home sewing machine, is to take, and I say this in my video, is to concentrate, having smoothed it all out right in front of you, about a 12 to 16-inch square. That's all I want you to concentrate on. Forget the rest of the quilt. You're concentrating on what is right in front of you. So you're going to be, you're wanting to quilt this corner block. That's all. That's all you're going to be doing. Now it's going to take hours and hours and hours. Get that in your mind, that on your home sewing machine, you're not going to quilt this in an afternoon. You're not. So again, get that mindset. Even if you have to set your machine up on the dining room table, just do it, just nibble away at it. That's what, then it doesn't get overwhelming. Knowing that it's going to take many hours, just nibble away at it and do a section at a time. And even if when you're in the middle and you have all this quilt on your lap and on the side and behind and in the throat, just smooth everything out and you can do it. If you have to shift the fabric, you will have to shift the fabric, because you're not going to be doing free motion quilting. Now on this machine, I'll show you in my video how I actually quilted this. I quilted it about every 1.5 inches. And on these, and in the middle here, on this large block, I didn't address this. I did the corner blocks. I actually went right around all my 1.5 inch circles, as it were. Oh. Sorry. Yeah, I went all around my 1.5 inch circles. And then I did stencil, which I'll be showing you. I did stencil a design on these two blocks here, my large blocks, and then I just free motioned a little flower in here. But again, I tell you in the video how perhaps you could address that right there. So this is my quilt. I bound it with a really pretty hot pink and white stripe, which is really summery and bright. I like striped bindings. I just think it adds a bit of pow to the edges of your quilt. This is obviously a summer quilt. I'm here on my porch. I will be selling this in my shop. Oh, I wanted to show you how I, remember I just added the borders on one side, and so how I addressed the ends, or the sides, whichever it may be. I just finished it off again with my pink and white binding on the top. So there's my quilt. I hope you can see it. There's my quilt. As I said, it's a beautiful day here on my porch. I wanted to show you on my what I have. If you remember my pillows, the pillow that I was demonstrating on. This was just an orphan block, if you remember. And I'm out here on my porch, and these go on my rocking chairs out here. So anyway, I just thought you'd be interested in seeing my finished quilt, my 10-minute quilt block, how I've actually quilted it. So the rest of the video will be showing that. So thanks for coming along on this journey with me on my favorite block in the world. Thanks. As you can see, I've quilted my blocks right around and done it in the ditch, stitched in the ditch, and now I'm going to be quilting these blocks here. And as I said before, what I'm going to do, I didn't fancy free motion quilting anything. I'm just going to figure out I'd say let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. You want to do this in your mind where you're going to be stitching around on this block. From this point, a gradual curve, 1, perhaps 2, perhaps 3, and then perhaps 4 stitches in here to make your quilting consistent across your entire thing. Now, as you've noticed, I have not stitched my sashings. That's the last thing I do. Again, I'm just relaxing my fabric in my lap and on the side of my sewing machine. I bring up my bottom threads, as you know you do. You put your needle down. Your top thread is catching the bottom. You're bringing your bobbin thread up. And that's so you don't have that nasty bit of bird's nesting. I've addressed this before several times. You go back down in the needle, and so you have your top thread and your bobbin thread on the top of your quilt, so that the backing of your quilt looks exactly like the front. You don't have that messy stuff. And then I just do a few, I literally just hold the fabric, do a few stitches in that hole, and again, I don't have a special foot on. I'm just going to come along, and I'm going to eyeball it. This is about 1.5 inches, maybe 1.25 inches, holding my thread, relaxing my quilt. Now remember what I'm doing. What are you doing? We're concentrating on this right in front of us. Forget about the rest of the quilt. I'm going to literally just be doing these blocks, as it were. The blocks are all the same. They all have this curve. Now, if I was free motion quilting it, I would perhaps just do an all over going into each block, but I'm not. This one I'm planning on quilting each block. So I hold my fabric, you know, nice and firm behind the needle. Again, I have my, I keep saying needle down. I have my needle down and my presser foot comes up. And that way, it's just, if you notice, I'm just manipulating my fabric on this curve. I'm letting my arm over here, my elbow do the work, come up. And I just come around. And I'm just following that curve about 1.5 inches to this sashing. And then I just sort of go in the same hole again and come up with my presser foot. And then I'll just do this. I like to, as you know me, I like to get rid of these things, the threads at the beginning. So again, I'm going to come right about the same distance, 1.5 inches or so. On this part, I'll put my needle down, presser foot goes down, I've put my threads up, and again I'm just going to follow along this stitching. And actually, with this quilt, you don't have to be daunted because it quilts up. If you've used a larger block, a larger square to construct this 10-minute block, you've only done a few quilting lines in each block. So you can quilt this quilt. I quite like that look. What do you think? Yeah, I quite like that. It's quilted. It's quilted every 1.5 inches. I've quilted along here, and then I'm just finishing it up. But then it'll be interesting. You've already seen the finished edge, but this one I'll do the opposite. And so it adds a little bit of movement. And you've quilted it yourself. You're not daunted, as I said before. Pardon me if I keep repeating myself, that you're having to quilt this entire huge quilt. And yes, I'm at the edge of my quilt. I am at the edge. I mean, you're saying, oh, how do I get in the middle of my big quilt? Well, with a little bit of muscle, and it does take a little bit of shoulder work, you can get into the middle of your quilt. And usually, actually, I'm not doing it. I usually do start in the middle, so I get that bit done quickly. But I've started here at the end. Again, smoothing my sashing, because I just have my regular foot, and then I'm just going to do this one. And yeah, so across the entire quilt top, as I usually do, I design as I go along. It's not really, I mean, I made a little square there. It's okay, it's fine. Just a slight curve. You just come down and I curve it to this point here on the straightaway, stopping at my sashing. And then of course, my sashing will be quilted, will be stitched. And as I've said in my other videos, whatever it may be, whatever size quilting you do want the quilting of your quilts consistent across your quilt. So this is about every 1.5 inches. So there's 1.5 inches there, 1.5 inches here, 1.5 inches to here, and then I'll do something in these blocks, perhaps a little bit more decorative. So I'll come back, I'll turn my quilt around here on this block, and I will just mirror image this quilting stitch from here all the way around. And then, as I said, I'm just concentrating on this one block. It's just it's much easier. Look, this whole corner is done now. It's quilted. When I do my sashing, because my sashing is small, that will be it. If you remember, this is the top edge of my quilt. I didn't put a border on this side of my quilt, so I will just stitch that along here when I'm done my quilt, and then I'll go along at the very end and I'll stitch before I stitch my whole perimeter of my quilt down, and then I'll attach my binding, and then my quilt will be done. But I'll come back and I'll show you perhaps what I'm going to be doing in these small blocks, and then how I'm going to address this block. And again, I have to determine, perhaps with a stencil or something, that I want it, every 1.5 inches, maybe a bit smaller if I have whatever stencil, or I could if you guys doing this big block, you could again just eyeball it, be very, your brain does so much of the work. So if you wanted to do a curve from like 1.5 inches down, you could just echo this block like this. You could go like here. See my fingernail? You could come back down like this and come over here and then back up there. And you could just do that and make this sort of diamond shape in there, and then your quilt could be quilted. This part has been quilted. This hasn't, remember? This hasn't. This is when we constructed the block, this block. So you might want to, secure, I'll probably do that. I'll probably want to secure this block not on top of that stitching, but right next to that stitching on the blue. I probably will do that. So that's about 1 inch, and then I'll address this blue block. But I will come back and show you how I've addressed this block. But yeah, if any of you have made this block and were in a quandary as to how to quilt it, there's just one suggestion. If you're good with free motion quilting, by all means, just go around and quilt the whole kit and caboodle, and then just do something in here, maybe even a flower if you're free motion quilting. But a lot of you are beginners, and you're making the blocks and you're thinking, well, I don't know how to quilt this thing. So here's just one suggestion. So hopefully you can see my stencil here. I can see it very well in front of me. I've pulled my threads up, having stitched along here. Now, when you're free motion quilting, you always want to adjust your brain, as funny as that sounds, to where you're going to be going on your needle, because remember, you're the stitch regulator. You're the one who's figuring out where your needle's going. It's just not going back and forth. It's going sideways and upwards and forwards and backwards. You can sew all sorts of ways. So that's why I quite like my stencils, because it gives me a guide where I'm going to be going. So I'm going to start on this part of my feather here, going along here to the stem and back and down the stem, coming back up the stem and going onto the flower, back up the flower, down the stem, around the flower, back the flower, down the stem. Now obviously with free motion quilting, it's not like hand quilting. Remember, it's a whole different thing. You're having to go over stitches. Absolutely. You absolutely are going to be going over stitches when you're free motion quilting. So, what the heck? So, oh, there we go. So I'll just start at this point, and I'll go along this stem, along that little flower, back down the stem, along that flower, in an oval, and back the stem. And my stitches are smaller, definitely, than regular stitches. Again, down that flower, around that stem. There's another one. And then around this big loop. I'm going to go right around. I'm going to go around again. I quite like double stitching it. Again, this takes tons of practice. Now I'll come back up here on this round, on this oval here. I'll come over to this one. And if you notice, it works up fairly quickly. My stitching works up pretty darn quickly. Go up to the top here, and then I come right back down that stem. Now I've gone down that stem maybe 3 or 4 times, and that's perfectly acceptable when you're quilting. Now I'm going to come and do this big loop over here and connect it. You see why I like my stencils? Because it takes my guesswork out of where the heck I'm going to free motion quilt. It's a difficult enough craft, a difficult enough thing to do without you trying to figure out. Look at my stencils, and I'm making a real pretty design. And I do go back on it. And are you going to go back perfectly? Of course not. So, oh, there's my thread. So that's a good place to stop, and I'll be finishing that up, and I'll be showing you the finished. My thread just broke. Okay, thanks. I've just finished quilting my stenciled block here, and I just wanted to show you. Again, I know you won't be doing free motion quilting. I hope I can focus in. I'm doing this myself on the stitching. As you can see, I've gone over this stitching an awfully lot on this stencil, and I don't know if you can see here, there was it's a little bit closer than an inch. This is about every 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch on this block, which is fine. It makes a statement. The rest of the the rest of the quilt is quilted slightly looser, but to get this block stitched like this, I actually added a few little loops at the very end, at the very corners, because the stencil didn't quite fill the block like I wanted it to. So anyway, that's my stitching on that block. I'm going to be finishing up. As you can see, I've stitched the about every 1.5 inches across the top of this quilt, except for my blocks, which I've made a feature. I have 2 of them. I'm going to go finish it up now, and I'll show you. You will have already seen the finished quilt. But that's a little bit of the detail of my stenciling, of my free motion quilting, which you guys are going to be able to do real soon. I'm going to be finishing up quilting my my quilt, and now I'm going to start the border. I always do my borders last. If you remember, I said I quilt the body of my quilt first, and then I'll come out, and then I do the sashings, and then I do the borders. So I've just sewn, I've just quilted, I've just stitched in this sashing here, and because I don't have a walking foot, my fabric does shift. It does. It moves along a little bit. So that's why when I do my borders, I usually hold my fabric fairly taut, and a few little tucks here and there on the top don't bother me in the least. But on the border, you will notice I've pulled my threads up here, and I will start, how I've just determined, again, as I'm coming along, I will start quilting. If you can see, I've quilted these 1.5 inch quilting stitches along in the body of the quilt. So on my border, I will just follow that stitching line right through visually through my sashing and onto my border. And if you'll notice, I'll take my few stitches, and then my fabric, I will just keep smoothing and smoothing and smoothing my fabric. You'll notice I haven't secured the outside of my fabric, because my fabric will move along slightly. You can see it's sort of raising here. I don't have a walking foot, and then I go right off. I've done this with another quilt that I've shown you how I've done. And then I just snip. I go back and I snip. Now again, what am I going to be doing? I'm going to be seeing this quilting on this block. Remember, there's going to be 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then, of course, my 5, where the blocks stop, that's where I'm going to be doing my quilting in my border. I really like, okay, it might get a bit old after a while, but I like this way of quilting my border. It's tidy, it's neat. There is tons of stops and starts. There is, absolutely. But I really like it. You can see my fabric's moving along a little, but then I go right off the edge, and I get a nice flat border that's stitched consistently right around. Well, actually, this is only 2 sides, so this is easy. I didn't put a border up here. I didn't put this floral up over here. So I'm going to be finishing this quilt up. I'm going to follow my stitching line from my block right through my sashing. I don't have to quilt my sashing, because again, this quilt has been stitched about every 1.25 inches or 1.5 inches across the whole border, except for the decorative bits. So I start there, and I can eyeball it nice and straight. Nothing's been stitched down, so it's just going to sew. You just sort of scratch it along, so you get a nice flat stitching, a border stitch. And I really, again, it's my go-to way of doing borders. I just stitch from that bit of sashing right down all the way the length of the border. This is just 2 sides of the border, and then I'm finished. So I hope you've enjoyed how I've sewn, how I've quilted this quilt in particular. It's my favorite block. So I just give you an idea of how you can quilt this on your home sewing machine, notwithstanding the stenciling in free motion. But as I said, you could have just stitched that along, and maybe even in just a grid pattern. But I'll have addressed that. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. And again, thank you so much for watching. Bye.